Welcome, everyone. We're going to start and people will continue trickling in. So welcome to our last webinar of the spring, although we have other activities planned, so keep posted. My name is Paloma Rago. I'm a faculty at the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University and one of the founding board members of Whistleblowing Canada. Founded in 2019, Whistleblowing Canada is a registered charity. The organization's purpose is to advance education on whistleblowing by conducting research on the whistleblowing phenomenon and culture in Canada, thus capturing knowledge, discovering new one, and sharing this information through seminars, conferences, and training for the interested and general public, as well as employees, whistleblowers, and leaders in Canadian public and private organizations. As a newly registered charity, Whistleblowing Canada relies on public support to expand its activities. So if you're so inclined, you can donate to the organization via our website. Your presence and interest means a lot to us. So today I have the privilege of hosting Edgar Schmidt and the webinar titled Whistleblowing, Necessary to Democratic Governance and the Rule of Law. Edgar Schmidt is a former legislative counsel, senior counsel, and ultimately general counsel in the Department of Justice Canada during the years 1999 to 2013. He was located in the Legislative Service Branch, responsible over the course of his career for the drafting of federal bills and occasionally regulations, for charter examinations of bills, for providing and organizing instruction in legislative drafting, and for the management of the professional development and advisory services section of the branch. More recently, 2016 to 2018, he had the good fortune to fill a 2-year term as a parliamentary counsel advance at the Parliamentary Council Office of New Zealand. Ed is also one of the founding, one of the board members here at Whistleblowing Canada. So today, for today's webinar, our speaker will talk for about 30 minutes. During this time, I will be muting everyone in case people join us during the talk. After the presentation, I will open the session for a conversation. As we all know, whistleblowing is a complex and sometimes very personal issue for some. So I would kindly ask that you ask succinct questions, that you're mindful that other people might want to talk as well. As a note, if ever we are Zoom bombed, because these things happen, or we are crashed by my toddler here, currently listening to Spider-Man, if all goes down, I will stop and then re-invite you to sign in again, just so we're prepared in this eventuality. We will be recording the session and we will make the recording available, so just you're aware. And I will give now power to Ed to start us off on this really interesting topic. Ed?
Well, hello all. I used to think that by the time I reached, later middle age, I would no longer be nervous giving presentations. I thought I'd have done it enough times, I would be relaxed and comfortable. And I find that I haven't quite reached that point yet. So if there are a few glitches along the way, please forgive me. I'm going to start now by sharing my screen, and I hope that that will work. I will ask you whether you are seeing that screen. Yes, okay, good. So what I want to do today is focus on a big picture. There are so many things about whistleblowing one could look at, And I want us to focus on the big picture. I remember as a child hearing this fable for the first time, and it fascinated me then, and I still like it. The old fable of the elephant and the people who were examining the elephant, and one examined the tusk, and one the ear, and one the side of it, and one the leg, etc. And each of them with such a partial view of things reached an quite erroneous conclusion as to what they were actually encountering. It's not a fan, a spear, a wall, a rope, a snake, or a tree. It's an elephant. And I think it's a little like that with whistleblowing. There are people who see it as a betrayal, as backstabbing, as sneaky, as breach of an employee's duties, as unnecessary, as disloyal, etc. But in fact, it's really quite simple. It's loyal service to your employing organization. So I want to explore different aspects of the big picture. Whistleblowing is just part of feedback in an organization. So let's think a little bit about what an organization is. It's people acting together in a structured way. Now, there's some activities that are best done individually. You brush your teeth, it's not really much of a group activity. You drive a car, it probably works best, even though you might have a backseat driver or a side seat driver, probably it works best when one person drives the car. Playing the flute is like that. Walking. Think about walking. There's a little picture of someone just learning to walk. Think about how complex that is as an activity, but it generally works best, or in fact, it only works if that child is in control of the situation and is learning how to do it. But there's some activities that go beyond the individual. When we build a road, that requires a whole lot of people. If we operate a hospital, if we educate young people, if we carry out a vaccination program, and that's what organizations are for. So an organization, Hans Kelsen was a legal scholar from Germany and also an expert in international law. And one of his insights was that an organization is essentially a set of rules. It's about how to do things, how to make decisions, how to implement them, how to communicate things. That's what an organization is. And that's what I want us to think about a little bit together. Whenever you have an organization, you have to have some established ways for that organization to make decisions. What will it do? And who decides? Is it going to be a board? Is it going to be members? How is it going to function for the making of decisions? Then how will they be implemented? An organization never functions as an organization. It's a concept, it's a legal fiction of sorts. So the only way to implement an organization's decisions is through human beings. But what will they be? Will they be officers? Will they be employees? Will they be someone else? Communicating information. Remember the image of the young child learning to walk. Well, when that child is learning to walk, she gets information from the nerves sensing pressure on her feet, from her inner ear and sense of balance, from all sorts of different things. All of that information is coming together and is being processed and is being used by her to maintain her balance and to make the next step. An organization has to create those same sorts of communication channels for it to function. Now, the state, as the organization I'm going to look at most particularly today, is a hierarchical organization. And that's typical of many of our organizations. Most corporations are hierarchical in structure. Senates in universities, for example, and hospitals and so on. That is the typical Western way of organizing an organization. There might be more anarchic structures possible, but we won't look at those, explore those today. So the state is a hierarchical structure, but I want to give you a chance to just out of the blue, I want you to look at this proposition, and Paloma is going to run a poll for us. Here's the proposition. The public service works for the government. That's a pretty simple statement. And Paloma, could you run the poll? Give us your quick views. We'll give you about 10 seconds. Okay, let's wrap it up and see what people have said. So the results, there are some views agree, some disagree, and some not certain. And not certain perhaps because there's truth to both. It's both true and untrue perhaps. So it's interesting for us to see that. Well, I'm going to have a look now at the state and some of the hierarchies in the state. And we'll come back to the poll that we just ran. In the state, we have a hierarchy of decision-making authority. And I've inverted a pyramid. We often see the pyramid the other way, with citizens at the bottom, and then the representative assembly, and then the executive officers, and so on. But I think it's because of our tendency to think of the top of a pyramid as somehow the important part, the core of it, I've inverted this pyramid because the state is fundamentally citizens. It is an organization of people working together to do something to improve their lives. Underneath the citizens, you have representative assembly. You have the citizens electing people to represent them in an assembly that will make decisions for the state. Then the representative assembly has executive officers. These we sometimes refer to as the government. And the question I asked you before, just a little parentheses here, we use government in an ambiguous way often. Sometimes we mean the state when we say government. We mean the entire apparatus of the state. But sometimes we just mean the executive officers of the moment. So when we refer to the Trudeau government, for example, we mean that collection of executive officers of the state that Justin Trudeau is the senior or the first among, the prime minister. All right, so we have the representative assembly, we have executive officers, and then we have staff, including managers and the staff. So that's the hierarchy of decision-making. And why do I say that those are the hierarchies? Well, sorry, I'm going to come back to that. I just want to focus now on, for a moment, on the right side of this slide. There's also a hierarchy of decisions. We have constitutions, statutes, regulations, administrative directions, and I haven't even accounted for judicial decisions in this, which are also state decisions. So thinking again about the hierarchy of authority, citizens are the owners of the state, and sometimes in democracies and in states, there are direct expressions of their wishes, plebiscites, referenda, so on. In the UK, for example, they had a referendum on Brexit. It was not binding in the sense that it forced, that it actually created a situation. It was an expression of opinion, but one that the parliament took very seriously. And sometimes in some democracies, referenda or plebiscites actually decide issues. It's more common, for example, in the US, where along in their November elections, they often have issues, questions put to the voters and directly decided. Then you have a representative assembly, reports to and is accountable to the citizens. And in our state, the Westminster style state that we have in Canada, it's the representative assembly that decides who will be appointed as executive officers. We sometimes loosely say, we elect a government. No, we don't elect a government, actually. We elect a representative assembly. And the government are the officers of the state that are appointed on the idea, on the understanding and expectation that they will have the confidence of the representative assembly. Then we have the public service that serves the entirety of the state. And why do I say that they serve the state? Well, think about something like employment insurance. It's a decision made by the representative assembly to institute a system of employment insurance, and the staff works under the direction of the executive officers to implement the decision taken by the representative assembly. So, looking briefly at the hierarchy of decisions, we call our Constitution the supreme law. It calls itself that, the supreme law of Canada. It regulates the outer limits of state power in the Charter, sets the basic rules of the state's functioning. Then we have statutes, enactments of the Representative Assembly, and regulations, a third tier, made usually by executive officers of the state, most of the time acting together. And you'll notice that each hierarchy, each tier of decisions needs to be consistent with the higher tiers in law. This is a matter of law. Statutes are only valid to the extent that they are consistent with the Constitution. Regulations are only valid to the extent that they are authorized by the statutes under which they are made, and so on. Okay, the state is a very powerful organization. We give to the state power over our property, over our very bodies, giving the state the authority to imprison us, or even, in the past at least, execute us. The state can compel actions such as school attendance, car registration, building permits, all kinds of things. The state has tremendous power. We give them that power. But history has demonstrated that the state can also serve as an instrument of oppression of its citizens. It continues to at times. And because of that awareness, the 20th century brought a movement in favor of recognizing human rights. Basically, my take on human rights is to say, it's the way that people wish to set limits on state action and remind each other and states that states were to serve human interests, not to oppress people. So in terms of chronology, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which a Canadian was instrumental in the drafting of it. For the moment, I'm forgetting his name. There's an organization in Edmonton that's named after him. It's all right, we'll leave it. Then in 1960, Canada adopted the Bill of Rights as a statutory recognition of rights. And then in 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Just an example of some of the things in the Charter, there's fundamental freedoms such as belief and expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, right to vote, etc. There's another limit on state power that I want you to think about briefly. Way back when, many centuries ago, in the development of Westminster democracy in the what is now the UK, the barons, who were then, together with bishops, about the only ones who were represented in Parliament, said to the sovereign, We will no longer accept decrees, edicts made by you without our consent expressed in Parliament. And they eventually were able to insist on this. And so it became a principle of law that citizens were to be governed only by laws approved by their elected representatives. Now, of course, the evolution of the democracy eventually came to include ordinary people. It took longer for women to be recognized as citizens and participating fully to vote. But eventually, our modern democracy essentially has the principle of every adult being entitled to vote, with some qualifications still. All right. Anyway, democratic legitimacy has an implication for regulations. The volume of lawmaking simply was impractical for Parliament to make all laws. And so the custom developed of Parliament authorizing the executive officers of the state, usually acting together, and they called that the Queen in Council, Governor General in Council in Canada, etc., to make delegated legislation. But the principle of democratic legitimacy is continued through the doctrine of ultra vires. So if regulations are made by executive officers of the state, they are only valid if they are within the authority of the act that Parliament has made. So that's how you as a citizen and your rights as a citizen to be governed only by laws that your representatives have approved, that's how that interest is protected. All right. So for the state as an organization to function appropriately, you have to have ways of assessing and reporting and considering whether the hierarchy of norms is being respected. The Constitution, statutes, regulations, administrative directions. There have to be ways of sorting out whether each level is consistent with all superior levels in the hierarchy of decisions. And when you carry out those decisions, you need to have information. So ordinary staff in the public service need to report to their managers on what they are experiencing. As they implement, for example, employment insurance, and someone says, you know what, I've run into an issue. Here is an application, and I'm not sure exactly how I am to treat this application. And so there'll be a discussion with managers on sorting out what it is that the act requires and how it should be addressed. And managers report to ministers and say, this is how things are going now in our department and with the mandate that we have been given. And executive officers in the government report to Parliament. Every department reports to Parliament on its work. It reports on a regular basis. And of course, they are accountable in other ways. They are subject to question. They can appear before committees, etc. There are different ways that executive officers report to and are accountable to the Representative Assembly. Then we have the Representative Assembly and all the rest as well, everyone below in that hierarchy reporting to citizens. And how does that happen? Well, it happens, quite frankly, largely through the press and through public channels such as CPAC and direct communications from members of Parliament to their constituents and election processes and so on. What sort of feedback is needed? Well, we need feedback in an organization on whether decisions taken and directions are actually being implemented. If Parliament enacted an Employment Insurance Act, but it was never actually implemented, no unemployed person ever was paid a single benefit under the Act, it would be ineffective. The organization would not be functioning as it ought. Then, are the decisions and directions having the desired outcomes? So, as you administer an Employment Insurance Act, for example, you will begin to find out, are unemployed people getting the benefits? Are these benefits helping them survive the period of unemployment and perhaps reestablish themselves in a workplace, etc.? And if it's not having the desired outcome, you may also want to know that. Has anything come to light that suggests improvements or defects or alternate arrangements? Think about this. In that feedback, bad news is at least as important as good news. Think about various ways that we recognize this in our ordinary life. Why do we have fire alarms and not absence of fire alarms? Because the absence of fire is not a situation, a context that calls for action, but the presence of a fire does. And so a fire alarm is bad news of a sort, but it's terribly important for us to receive that. In your car, you usually have all kinds of alerts and warning lights. The electrical system function, engine malfunction, low oil pressure, your ABS braking system no longer functioning properly, etc. All of these different warning lights. You want the warning of a problem. The bad news is actually terribly important to you for your own safety and for the health and the well-being, if you want to put it that way, of the vehicle. In health, this is a little chart of PSA test results. Well, you want to know if the health test that you've gotten indicates that there is an illness. That may be bad news of a sort, but it's terribly useful and important, especially if you get this news at a time when corrective action might still be taken. So bad news is important, and that's the same in an organization. Organizations to function well need the bad news. But here is where whistleblowing comes in. Organizations always are made up of human beings, act through human beings. And in the state, sometimes political actors don't want bad news to emerge because they feel it would not foster their chances of re-election. Or it might, in an individual case, not improve their chances of continuing to serve in cabinet or have a more senior cabinet appointment, or perhaps eventually be chosen as leader of their party, or some other thing. So there are personal ambitions or wishes that can militate against presenting negative information. Managers in the public service sometimes want to present only a positive picture to ministers. Again, maybe because they want to foster their promotion or a pay bonus, or it's just less trouble if you don't pass on the bad news. And ordinary public servants may also have some of those competing interests. So the organization's interests and the interests, personal interests of various actors in the organization can be in tension. And for the organization to function well, the organizational interest has to prevail. So, how can one foster the feedback an organization needs? I'm not going to spend much time on this because there are many other presentations that were focused on this already. But basically, you have to be clear on the obligations and duties. You want to foster a culture of learning and information sharing rather than self-protection. You want to provide channels so that if there is a roadblock to information sharing, that there is a way around that roadblock to still ensure that the information gets to the people that need the information. And you want to protect those honest and accurate reporters, because if you don't protect them, then that system, that communication system, will no longer function. Who will report if they are not protected? So, laws fostering information flow, access to information. One of the principles that has become clear, especially in the last 20, 30, 40 years, is that democracy requires citizens to have access to information. Now, the current access to information regimes in federally and in the provinces always requires a request. It is initiated by a citizen request. But in order to make a request, you tend to have to need to know that there's something important to ask about. And you may not know that yet. So just an idea to think about. This is a little throwaway idea for you to think about. What if we change the access to information regime? There are other ways to improve it too, terribly important ways. But what if we empowered public servants that actually want to serve the public to initiate information sharing under Access to Information Acts, instead of waiting for some citizen to ask for the information and then allow the information administrators to delay and defer and or hide information? Public servants with knowledge of the relevant information could initiate a request and say, here are documents I want to release. And they would have to process the public servant's initiated request promptly, and the public servant would then be free to release that information and should be protected in doing it. Now, there's just a thought. Anyway, we also have whistleblower protection laws, and we have mandate reporting. Regular reports to Parliament, Auditor General reports, Parliamentary Budget Officer reports, and there are also, at the bottom of this slide, special examinations and reports related to my own whistleblowing. I want to spend a very little bit of time telling you about that story. Then my story, my particular whistleblowing, related to three provisions. The first ones were about examination of bills. The Minister of Justice was to examine every bill in order to ascertain whether any provisions were inconsistent with the Canadian Bill of Rights or the Charter, and report any such inconsistency to the House of Commons at the first convenient opportunity. Then, one of the other provisions, and this was in the Statutory Instruments Act, said that the Deputy Minister of Justice is to examine proposed regulations to ensure, or each proposed regulation, to ensure that it's authorized. Remember, the democratic legitimacy requires that regulations be consistent with, be authorized by the act under which they're made. Secondly, or thirdly, that the regulation doesn't trespass on existing rights and freedoms and isn't inconsistent with the Charter and Bill of Rights. And again, there's a reporting requirement. Now, what was being done? Well, the Department of Justice, after decades of doing otherwise, said, well, when we make this assessment, we're going to ask ourselves, how likely is it that this provision is contrary to the Charter or unauthorized? Is it very low, the chance of it being inconsistent? Is it low? Is it medium? Is it high? Is it very high? A high range was probably invalid or illegal. In other words, the balance of probabilities favored illegality in the assessment of the Department of Justice. Very high was the likelihood of a challenge was almost certain. And then the department had a further category. Is this at the far end of the almost certain range, where so it's so certainly unlawful that the clever lawyers in the Department of Justice can't even think up one argument on the side of consistency or authority. So here you can see visually, that red line represents what gets reported. Well, here's a quick poll for you. Was what the department was doing exactly what the statutory provisions require? So here's the proposition is that what the department was doing is exactly right. Agree, disagree, can't say. All right, let's give you 3 more seconds. So again, a variety of views. And it's interesting to see, for me to see those variety of views. Now a second question. Was what here's the proposition, sorry, it's not a question, it's a proposition. What the department was and is doing serves the interests of citizens acting through their organization, the state. So the focus of this proposition is the interests of citizens. Maybe another 5 seconds. Okay. Again, a variety of views. Well, I'll tell you quickly my story and then we need to wrap this up. I tried reporting to senior management saying, I don't think what we're doing meets the requirements of the statutes. That didn't work. I tried reporting to the integrity commissioner who operates under the federal whistleblowing law. That did not work. I tried an access to information request, and the department concealed the documents, including the document that I revealed to you earlier, the excerpt that I revealed to you earlier. The department refused to disclose it, did not even disclose its existence. And what it revealed purported to say that what they were doing was ensuring that legislation was consistent with the charter and authorized by the enabling legislation, which is not what they were doing. So the access to information request didn't work because they didn't respond honestly to what was asked of them. So then I went to the court and asked the court to declare what the examination provisions required. And to my profound disappointment, the federal court and the Federal Court of Appeal said, oh yes, that's exactly right what the department is doing, despite the fact that for 30 or 40 years, the department claimed to be doing something different. And up to 1 month before I filed my claim in the federal court, the Minister of Justice in Parliament was still asserting that they were ensuring that legislation was consistent with the charter. It didn't work. Okay, so what to wrap up the thing on my own little whistleblowing experience, what can still be done? Well, the minister may see reason. Members of Parliament could pass an act correcting the situation. Court action in the Superior Court of a province might find a different solution. There may be other courts who can interpret legislation a little differently than the federal court did. And citizens can help this happen by raising the issue with their MPs and ministers. All right, coming back to the big picture. A well-functioning organization needs feedback. The same sort of feedback that an individual gets from their nervous system, an organization has to get from its human beings. And feedback necessarily includes bad news feedback. In fact, sometimes that's the most important news. So a wise organization that wants to ensure it functions well and gets all of the information it needs, including the bad news, will take these various steps to try and ensure communication channels for all feedback. That's all I have to say. I'm turning it over to Paloma now.
Thank you, Ed, for your presentation. And there's lots to think about. I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen, if that's possible, and we'll start taking some questions. One thing that I find particularly interesting in my work is linked very much to the nonprofit and charitable sector, and that's a prevalent question, where organizations that mean well don't always do well. And so what's the relationship between saying wrongdoing and causing harm to the organization? And that's something you talked about. And for me, I think it's a really important point, an ethical conundrum that many whistleblowers face, and they face backlash regardless of what they do. And that's very problematic in itself. So I am open to questions. Are there any comments, questions, reactions? And you can unmute yourself. You're right now muted, and so we can use either the hand raising feature if there are several people that want to talk, or you can use the chat as well. David Kilbort, you're unmuted.
Sure, thank you very, very much for this. I've made some notes and so on. But where are we now? What's the situation of whistleblowing legislation in Canada today?
The whistleblowing legislation in Canada is almost uniformly severely defective. There are various organizations that have studied this, and I can't even go into all of the reports, but your best bet is to contact Whistleblowing Canada, contact the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University, contact the Government Accountability Project, is that what it's called, in Washington. These organizations have done studies of various legislation and have documents that set out the important characteristics of successful whistleblowing systems. And they would have that information, and probably this information is available on the websites of Whistleblowing Canada, Center for Free Expression, GAP, etc. Sorry, I can't be more specific on that, but the legislation is seriously defective.
I can, if you allow me, Ed, I'll
Yes,
pass it
please.
to Pam, who has done a lot extensive research on the topic and really knows the intricacies of the legislation. And I know she knows that because I've read her thesis. So,
hi. Well, I was going to suggest, David, that GAP and the International Bar Association have just done a study assessing all of the laws, the whistleblowing laws in the world against best practices. So if you, I could send you the link to that report.
Please do. Thank you.
Yes, and Canada actually has come out last.
Oh, dear.
It contains no best practices. In fact, the law suppresses rather than protects. The public, the commissioner responsible for supposedly the external disclosure mechanism that Ed went to and got no satisfaction. He has absolute power to decide if you, pardon? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Yeah, he has absolute power to decide if you even get a day in court, if you could, can go to the tribunal. And in the last 14 years, very few have managed to get there. So really, I'm wondering, Ed, as you were talking about legislation and vetting it for compliance with the charter, I'm wondering if there might not be a charter case against this law. I suspect it does not comply. Anyway, that's for a future discussion.
I wanted to just say one quick recognition here. Janet Hicks reminded me that it's John Peters Humphrey, who was the legal scholar from Canada, who was one of the principal drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. John Humphrey. Thank you, Janet.
There is Patrick here that has a question. Then after we have a question in the chat.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I just want to make mention of two things. We speak a lot about the legislation and a need to change it, but wouldn't it be true to say that no matter what the legislation may be, if you're willing to work with it and there's a will, there's a way to do the right thing in the end. But no matter what change you bring to a legislation, if there's no will to do the right thing, and you want to use your mandate to hide behind in order not to do what's required, no change in legislation is never going to change anything. The other thing I want to mention from the reading I've done on the subject is often we hear there's not a lot of cases that were referred to the tribunal when it comes to reprisal. Now we're talking about the federal level here. But what I've read is that cases that are good go to conciliation. And because they are good, they get settled at conciliation. Thank you.
One or two things to make in comment. The fact that almost nothing went to the tribunal is an indication that while legislation is not sufficient, good legislation is useful. And the federal legislation allows the Integrity Commissioner to be a kind of gatekeeper for any matter going to the tribunal. So if you as the whistleblower don't have the right to go to the tribunal under the federal legislation, that's got to be seriously defective. So that responds to the question of whether legislation is useful. Yes, legislation is useful, but is it sufficient? No. Pamela knows a great deal about that now. I actually turn it over to her to talk about culture.
Yes, absolutely. And Patrick, you make a very good point that if there is a will, people can find a way. They can work to make the systems work in the best possible way. The reverse is that if there is not a will, it doesn't matter how good or how perfect your legislation is, it will not be held up appropriately or in accordance. It will not be implemented properly in accordance with the law. And, there has been a lot of work done on this. Culture is largely affected not only by leaders' behaviors, and it's not just what leaders say, it's what leaders actually do. And cultures come together around the signals sent out by leaders about what they want, and then people in groups pick up those signals and those cues, follow the leaders. People in groups themselves actually respond to group forces such as conformity in groups and obedience to authority. And if they feel threatened, they punish, the people they see who are threatening them. Often they see whistleblowers as a threat. But in terms of leaders' signals, I don't know if you've noticed, if anybody raises the issue of whistleblowing to members of parliament or even to the prime minister, they all say, oh yes, it's so important. Whistleblowers are so important. We think it's always important to pay attention to whistleblowers. We protect whistleblowers, and so on and so forth. But what they do is completely the opposite. So imagine as a manager in the public service and you see this, well, then you're going to get it. You're going to get that what the politicians say and what they do, for example, they do not improve the law. They have a report which made, I'm not sure, I see David Hutton is here. He will know how many, I think there was something like 30 changes recommended to the law so that it would be in compliance with best practices. They manipulated the rules of Parliament so that this unanimous report in 2017 recommending improvements to the law actually never saw the light of day, never was discussed in Parliament. And then recently, as a result of a lot of pressure put on by some of the groups, whistleblowing groups, including us, a few members were persuaded to retable this report because it was simply filed with no discussion in Parliament, filed, in the clerk's filing cabinet somewhere. So they retabled it, but they made the same mistake again, asking for a comprehensive government response. And governments don't seem to know what the meaning of the word comprehensive is. Anyway, that means there's no debate in Parliament for 4 months. And so we're the same, they're going through the same process that enabled it to be buried the last time. So if they really were serious, they would have forgone asking for a comprehensive response and simply a member of Parliament, it just needed a member to stand up and ask for a motion to concur with this unanimous report. There would have, under the rules, they could have then had debate and discussion, and the people's representatives could have said yay or nay. I mean,
thank you, Pam. I know you're very passionate. We all know how passionate Pam is about the topic. I just am mindful of the time.
Sorry.
No, of course. Pam knows you have any questions. Pam knows the answer and then some.
David as well might have some remarks on this one.
Yes.
Could I jump in? David Hutton here.
Yes, if you can briefly, and then I'll let Ed
Sure.
answer some of the questions in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, just to, since Pam invited me, just to reinforce what's been already said, it's very difficult to express just how bad the situation is in Canada. We have a law that is not just not working very well, it's completely dysfunctional and works against the interests of the whistleblower, and it really creates a trap for people. Pam mentioned the parliamentary review of it. I think the members of that committee were shocked by what they learned. But again, there was no action taken. And finally, I have to say, this is not a partisan matter. What we have here is that successive governments have taken steps to sustain the situation. They've ignored the dysfunction in the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner's office. And the result is that in 13 years, not a single whistleblower has been protected by this law. Not a single person has received compensation or any kind of redress for the reprisals that they've suffered. That's an astonishing track record. And that's why Canada's federal system is the worst in the world.
Absolutely. And there is a presentation by actually one of the the people who did the study, Tom Devine of GAP. His whole presentation at our last webinar is on our website, and you can get from that, if you wanted to listen, all of the details of the failures of the law.
Thank you. Ed, I invite you. I don't know if you had the chance to read some of the questions in the chat. It's getting pretty busy in there. So if you can take a stab at a few questions, it would be great.
Okay, do you have a particular one you would like to suggest I look at, Paloma?
So there's the first one from Susan Holmes asking about the Supreme Court and whether or not there are political reasons why the Supreme Court doesn't always take up some cases.
Yeah, if the question concerns why did the courts, the federal court and the Federal Court of Appeal, decide what they did in my case, I really don't know. One of the factors that we generally are not supposed to point out is that the judges all had a significant connection to the Department of Justice in one way or another. Well, all. Maybe that's saying too much. Their connections varied, but in the Federal Court of Appeal, 2 of the 3 judges were former senior lawyers in the Department of Justice. So it would be a little unusual, perhaps, for them to renounce the very policy that was adopted while they were there as a manager. Anyway, I don't know whether that explains why they made the decision they did. I think that it may also have been a factor that they just don't like the idea of a public servant asking the court to correct what the department was doing. I think they may not have been very favorably inclined to addressing that issue or having it being raised in that way. Okay, enough on that. Next question. Anything else, Paloma, that you'd like to suggest I look at?
There was a question about comparative work done across Canada. So we have a sense at the federal level, but what about provincial legislation? I know that our organization has done some work recently in New Brunswick, but can you speak to some of the studies or what's going on across the country?
Ian Braun, who is a member of the advisory board at the Whistleblowing Canada, is working on his PhD. And I'm not sure that this particular project is part of his PhD project or not, but he is, in addition then to his PhD work, doing a comparison and analysis of the various acts in Canada, provincially as well as federally. So I'm not sure that that work is complete, but it's well underway. And that would be a piece of work that would be very useful for us to, and I'm sure it'll be made available to the public when it's complete.
If I may, just briefly, there has been a study that was already done in 2018 that takes us down that path and identifies the fact that the provincial legislation is almost completely carbon copies of the federal legislation, with all the same weaknesses and failures, so that whistleblowers across Canada are in the same terrible situation. I can also send out links to that study if you wish.
Please.
It's Scott Campbell here in New Brunswick. That was my question about the provinces.
Okay.
And I guess the real underlying reason for my question was to try and determine, is there 1 or 2 provinces or some provinces sort of stand out as possible thin edges of the wedge for improvement? Because I think if we can make some ground in one particular province, maybe it's somewhere that we can point to say, look to what that province is doing? Like, is there someone that's more, one particular province that stands out as maybe more likely to receive the changes?
I can answer that. Ed, is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so it has been said that British Columbia has shown a bit of leadership from that perspective, in that they have the ability or the requirement for what's called, well, instead of the whistleblower having, David, you'll know the word reverse.
Onus. Reverse onus.
Reverse onus. That's right. So instead of the whistleblower having to prove that retaliation, that the managers did retaliate against them, the managers have to, the onus is on them to prove that their behaviors were not retaliation. So, but that is, just the one of 20 best practices. For the most part, that's the only good part. The rest is, much the same as the federal legislation. So so to answer your question, BC.
We are soon running out of time, and there are still good questions. I think there were two interesting questions that you can maybe speak to, Ed. One is Tracy mentioned whether or not we should just go ahead and move towards strategic litigation, as a way to kind of force certain changes. And so I'd like to hear what you think about that. And lastly, I guess we had a question about how does one become involved in improving and supporting whistleblowing initiative and programs in Canada. And so that I will leave to Pam to tell us exactly how we can do that. And through Whistleblowing Canada, of course, and we'll make a plug there. But Ed, please, if you can comment on the strategicness of litigation and if that's a strategy.
Litigation can be useful. There's no question about it, but there needs to be a legal foundation on which the litigation can draw. And some of that foundation may need to be developed because, first of all, the acts, the whistleblowing legislation, as we know, is not very strong. It provides no access to the courts. So in fact, it may even serve to limit access to the courts, current whistleblowing legislation, and other kinds of actions for damages and so on. There are all kinds of impediments in the law. So I think that's something that creative lawyers should be thinking about with creative citizens, but it's not a very easy path. It's not a self-evident path.
If I can just add to that, having had the pleasure of working closely with Pam on her thesis project, one thing that's really interesting from litigation is the access to information. And I think maybe someone mentioned this, but through disclosure, sometimes you can force also information to come to light. And that's a powerful tool to expose wrongdoing. One of the big problem there is, and I think that came up in other webinars that we've had, is the resources to do so. Because, it's not just everyone that can engage in this strategy, and you have to have not only the skills, but the financial resources and the time to do that.
I just want to, before you leave that, I want to remind people that it was in fact only by reason of the litigation in the federal court that what the department was doing became known, because what was being said to Parliament and what was being disclosed under access to information was something completely different. So litigation can be very useful. I want to second what you just said, Paloma, in bringing out information.
I'll ask Pam to to quickly answer the how does one become involved in improving and supporting whistleblowing program, and then leave the last question to Susan Holmes, who has her hand up, and then we'll have to conclude because we're really running out of time.
So I'm sorry, just to clarify, how people, what was the question you wanted me to respond to? How people can be involved in?
Yeah, how does
improving?
one become involved in improving and supporting whistleblowing initiatives and programs in Canada?
Well, there are a number of things that citizens can do. One of the first things I would suggest is that you sign up for our updates and to volunteer just to be an ambassador for the organization and to be involved in campaigns as we learn more and as we share more and as we advocate more for changes in public policy. The other thing is to talk about, you know, what you're learning and what the changes you think that need to happen. If you support them, talk to your members of parliament, write to your members of parliament, sign petitions, all of those things that citizens can do who are aware of what's going on in the world around them and want to take action to make things better. We don't have to just sit and take it. You know, if we think something is unacceptable and inappropriate, we have to say. We do not have to accept the egregious wrongdoing that's happening in our country, that, and when people try to expose it, they're punished. And it's not just a slap on the wrist, it's devastating punishment, it's destructive punishment, and it's totally unacceptable. And if we allow it to continue, actually, you know, we're endorsing and legitimizing the growth of corruption. And we're watching and enabling the disintegration of our democratic institutions.
Thank you, Pam. Last question, and then after I'll give Ed the final word, and we'll wrap the session. And those who want to stick around and chit chat, you're more than welcome, but officially I'll end the session. So Susan.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, it's so wonderful to see all the people's names attending this session. Being a whistleblower myself, it always feels good to know there's a solidarity and a growing awareness. The one thing I wanted to pick up on was the access to information, and that is an incredible tool. However, the depravity that is existing in our governments, and I'll speak from experience here in Prince Edward Island, is that now the access to information is being withheld to the point of contempt of court. And so we have a deputy minister at this point who is in contempt of court and has still not produced the documents, and also then purported that the documents had been destroyed that were once in existence. So one can see that if we allow this situation to go unintended, and I think Paloma, your statement, or I mean Pam, I think you said it. We sort of contribute by allowing the situation to occur and to not hold the officials accountable. I'm just surprised that the press is so apathetic. And I'm wondering, they seem to like the stories that are more personal and graphic, and you know, it would increase ratings on their show, I think, as opposed to the nitty gritty of what has to happen to ensure that some of these fraudulent practices and malfeasance is not encouraged. So just for everyone to know, a deputy minister is in contempt of court in Prince Edward Island with signing a paper to withhold access to information requests.
Thank you, Susan. Ed will give you the last word on how to conclude this session.
Well, I just hope that in the end, we've learned something from each other, explored a few ideas, and I want to come back maybe just to the one central thought. I think it is important that we keep in mind the big picture and not confuse the interests of executive officers of the state or managers in the state with the overall interest of the public in the state. The state is to serve citizens and not the reverse. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, and please join me to thank Ed and Whistleblowing Canada for hosting the event. So this, for now, is our last webinar of the spring, but we are working on exciting and other new activities. And we will keep you informed. If you haven't joined the mailing list, please do so by going on our website. Thank you again for coming. Those who want to linger and talk with Ed or talk among each other, you're welcome to do so. So thank you, everyone.